You've heard AM, you've heard FM. Now, tune into DM Radio, the world's longest running show about data. Each week, host Eric Kavanaugh interviews the brightest minds in the world of information management. Want to be on the show? Send an email to info@dmradio.biz. Now, here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio. That's right, folks. 16 years old. We turned 16 earlier this month. It's hard to believe. Time flies when you're having fun. We've done hundreds and hundreds of shows, you can imagine, over 16 years. Lots of guests, lots of great guests talking all about data. I knew data would be huge back in 2001 when I dove into this industry, and I was blown away and have been blown away by just how big it remains and how big it will remain. Because, of course, data is the lifeblood of businesses. You need to understand your data to know what's happening in your business. You need to understand your data at scale these days, at least if you're a large organization. That brings a whole new set of challenges. And then, of course, there's this thing called AI, artificial intelligence, which has been around for decades. It's not new. AI has been here for a long, long time. But we went through a couple AI winters because, quite frankly, the compute power wasn't there, the expertise wasn't there. We really couldn't pull off what we wanted to do. But now the compute power is ready and willing and able to rock and roll. And so things are happening at a blistering pace. I can tell you, I've never seen so much change so rapidly hitting the market as we've seen the last year or so since OpenAI rolled out ChatGPT and, of course, Bard, or now Gemini, it's called, from Google. You've got Claude from Anthropic. You've got lots of other players in this space doing things, and it is fundamentally changing what's happening. But I can tell you this, data is going to be central to the efficacy of AI, and knowing which data to use to train models or to train even your own models, whether it's customer churn or propensity to buy or whatever the case may be, next best offer, whatever kind of models you're training in-house, or if you're building your own RAG model, retrieval augmented generation, for using generative AI, you're going to need data. You're going to understand. You have to understand your corporate data, what it means, and you have to trust that data. So today, I'm so excited to have three industry veterans on the call. We've got Neal Hansch calling in from Silicon Foundry. He's on the phone. We've got Andrew Turner from Praxi. He's got a long history in this business, and none other than Jim Starkey of AmorphousDB. Jim is one of the original database designers from, I think, almost 1,000 years ago, if you go all the way back, like in the 1970s. And he sat down to develop a whole brand spanking new database. But real quick, let's throw it over to Neal Hodge, who I know is dialing in. Neal, you're in the business of working with Fortune 100 companies to help the C-suite understand what's happening. And I guess you're in hot demand right now because everyone in the business is scratching their heads thinking, how do we attack this? What do we do? Which tools do we use? What use cases do we use? Tell us real quick the kind of conversations you're having with your clients these days, Neal, from Silicon Foundry.
Yeah, so thank you so much for letting me be a part of the discussion today. As you referenced, Silicon Foundry's business at the heart is we work with the Fortune 1000, the C-suite, helping them navigate, understand, and leverage external innovation. And whether that's new technologies, platforms, sometimes services, business model innovation, and the corporates we work with are across the world, across all industries. But as you touched upon, the universal area of interest right now and urgency is all things AI and Gen AI, and really trying to understand what's real, what's not, where are we in the hype cycle, and most importantly, as that dovetails to what are the applications today that they, as these executive decision makers, should be ensuring that their organizations are, on the, I wouldn't even say on the forefront of, but are aware of, recognize where they should be piloting, and really across their organizations, whether it's manufacturing, product management, MarTech, sales, you name it. Really, no part of the organization potentially untouched. But who are the solutions providers that they should be engaging with, and how should they be leveraging this for their businesses today? And it went, as you said, AI is not new. Neural networks, if you will, we're going on probably 3 decades, but it really became at the forefront of the conversations in the executive hallways and certainly the boardrooms of what are we doing about AI and how it will impact our business for the better.
Yeah, well, and there's all this talk about responsible AI. We did a show just on Monday on our other program, Inside Analysis, with a couple experts, including someone from the Institute for Experiential AI over there at Northeastern University in Massachusetts. And I had some very interesting comments about the ethics of using AI. And of course, this whole essence of black boxes, because right now, ChatGPT is a black box. Llama, of course, from Facebook, as I understand it, is open source. Black box technology is it's not new either. We've had black boxes for a long time. The open source movement really changed that, I think, to a large degree, but we're kind of back to where we started from in terms of lacking transparency and how these things work. From your perspective, how big a deal is that? And I'm guessing it comes into play as you recommend to the C-suite of these companies how to tackle this. We have to be careful about where and how we deploy these new engines, right, Neil?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think the degree to which that's on the forefront or on the minds, is to some respects industry specific. Obviously, some industries like healthcare, like highly regulated, and black box would be unacceptable. But others like auto-generating ad copy for display ads or whatnot, low risk. And so, but then of course, also trying to figure out how do we take our data and get it into the mix, and does that need to be sectioned off? And so, I think it depends on the use case that we're talking about. And we had a panel recently with the head of AI for Goldman Sachs, and a big part of the conversation was just internal knowledge base, finding the right information for employees internally. But then how do you expose potentially one team seeing data from another team where they shouldn't, and permissioning that? So there's so many different sub elements from within. But I think to your point, it depends on the industry, it depends on the use case, where ethical AI or just the access to data and how that would be included in the LLMs, is a core part of the conversation.
Yeah, and real quick, and then I'll bring in our other guests. As I look at my results working with Gemini, because that's the tool of choice for me, I just decided that a few months ago, and I've been working with it ever since, and I love it. It's amazing. These large language models tend to be very proficient and very accurate when the domain of the topic is very well published, because there's a lot of material that they've been able to train on, like how routers work or how a motherboard works, for example, or even how plumbing works in a house, basic stuff like that, where there's a ton of content out there that has been published and is relatively homogeneous in terms of its descriptions of how things work. In those contexts, it's really powerful and really quite compelling. And in saying that, what I'm pointing out is that anyone who wants to learn about something these days can hop on. It used to be able to go to Google and find various pages it would point you to, but in this context, you just hop on and ask it to write you an article of a certain length and give it all kind of prompts about the details you want, and bam, there you go. Which to me is going to, and you and I talked about this briefly, it's going to reinvent media. It's going to be incredibly disruptive for media, but also for education and just for ramping up your own knowledge about a particular subject area. That is massively game-changing stuff. What do you think, Neil?
Oh, I agree. It's really just depending on the use case, the sheer degree to which it's going to have impact. And I think that's where, and things are moving so fast. I think to your earlier comment, assessing that is difficult today. I would say that excitement, at least in the circles that, for Foundry we travel in, excitement far outweighs fear of the implications here and the degree and level of impact. And even, the topics of, hey, is it going to replace employees? I think, the common theme that we have is it's going to place the low-level tasks to enable the employees to level up in terms of the strategic nature of their tasks. So, but there's still so much more to come. And I think, as you also highlighted, Gemini is your favorite. Just trying to track all of the different platforms right now, and which types of users are using which types of companies and which parts within the company, continues to be a every single day adventure.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing, and it really we live in interesting times, right? There's the old Chinese proverb, cliche that says, "May you live in interesting times." Of course, it's not a well wish, right? Uh,
Yeah.
but I will also just in passing, I'll throw out one of my other favorite Chinese proverbs, which is, "Do not speak the big truth." Oh, that one gets me every time.
Powerful.
You can kind of see it in their culture. It's like, no, shh, don't say the big truth, be quiet. But anyway, on to some bigger and better and bolder truths. I'll throw it over to Jim Starkey. And Jim, speaking of innovation and changing things, you've got an amazing history in this industry, one of the forefathers, really, of database technology. And you were telling a story about how you came up with the idea for Amorphous DB, which, as it happens, is an ideal database engine for artificial intelligence. So why don't you tell that story real quick, because it kind of blew my mind. Go ahead.
Okay, well, this was shortly after I had retired from NuoDB, and I was going to do something with my life for a while other than doing database innovation. And then the Snowden revelations about what the government had been collecting, and there were a lot of people upset about the amount of data that they were collecting. I looked at it and said, well, I'm not that concerned because I don't know if they actually know how to correlate and put together all of that data. It's just too big. It's too complicated. And
Right.
I thought about that for 2 or 3 days. And then I had this unfortunate, oh, that's how you do it. And as I said, once you have the idea, you can't undo the idea.
You
So
can't unthink an idea.
you can't unthink an idea. So Amorphous eventually grew out of that. And Amorphous really was an exercise and heresy in 6 dimensions. I was just going to go back and challenge all of the ideas having to do with database systems. And I've been around the database world for a long time. I mean, I had worked at a place called CCA on the ARPANET on a hierarchical database system. I got hired into DEC on a very blatant bait and switch and got stuck porting IDMS to the PDP-11, which is a codicil database. And then I actually went into DEC with the intention of convincing them the relational databases was the way to go in the world. And I eventually succeeded at DEC, but it took a long time. And then started a couple database companies. What I have always been looking at is the problems in data management and creative solutions to getting around them. And I think I've been fairly successful. A lot of my ideas are generally accepted around the database world. One of the ideas I had at DEC, which was at the time extreme heresy, what's now known as multi-version concurrency control. And at the time before that, with database systems, there was doing two-phase locking, and somebody would list the employees and then go for lunch, and the database was locked until they came back from lunch. And I thought that was just a terrible way to do things. And one day I was driving down the road and had this idea for multi-version concurrency control. You just keep different versions of the record and do some booking to know which one you should look at, and nobody blocks anybody. And that worked out very well. I mean, that was approximately 1982. And now I think I look at Wikipedia, last time I looked, they had 84 database systems that use some variation on multi-version concurrency control, which proves 2 things. One, innovation is fun. And, if you have a very long life, you can live to see it readily accepted.
Wow. That's
So,
fascinating. And you talked about all kinds of other improvements and all kinds of challenges, things like garbage collection, for example. But let's kind of dial into this multimodal concept. I was talking with you the other day, and you were mentioning how it's a great engine for AI, because in AI, you have to do multiple steps of things. Typically, you have a recipe. An algorithm is just a recipe, basically. And so in most applications of AI, you have to have your models, of course, that you've trained somewhere on some data, or maybe it's an adversarial training. But the point is, you want to attack a certain problem, and you have to go through multiple steps. And a lot of times it goes from one system to another. And anytime you jump from one system to another, there is some latency, there is some risk of the connection being lost. There's all kind of issues that come into play. And if I understand it correctly, one thing that makes Amorphous DB special in that use case is that you have all these modalities under the same hood. So theoretically, you can facilitate, you can underpin AI in ways that other databases can't. Is that about right?
I think that's about right. And just give an example. And one of the initial ideas in Amorphous DB, um, I one of the things it did in ancient history was inventing the blob, and that eventually got accepted by everybody. But a blob in a database system was just this amorphous stuff. Sorry, you shouldn't use that word. Undifferentiated stuff. And the database system didn't understand that this was a Word document or this was a PDF. So something that amorphous, from the beginning is I wanted to have, word search, intelligent search, kind of like what everybody uses on the internet, through Google and for accessing a database. And, since a large amount of the data, in any realm is in documents, and if you're going to be able to retrieve documents, it's not good enough just to be able to handle, raw ASCII text, then you have to really handle documents in the form that they come. So Amorphous has very intelligent handling for things like PDFs and Word documents and HTML documents, and it knows how to take them apart, it knows how to index them. And so that's very interesting because you can do things with Amorphous that you can't do with any other database systems except specialized document stores. But then pushing it forward into the AI world is, of course, what the intersection of AI and databases tend to be with vector processing, where a vector represents the content, the intelligent content of something. And so, Amorphous has always supported vectors, arrays. That's kind of elementary these days. The question is, the first step is, can we put in similarity vectors and index vectors to do that very quickly? And that's well accepted technology, and that's well and good. So, that's what qualifies, I guess, as an AI database. But you can go a great deal further than that, and that is, let's look at what we really want to do. And so you want to put stuff in a database, and you actually want to do an intelligent retrieval using, AI technology. And so we've got the stuff, it's loaded, but you want to load another document. What you really want to be able to do is load a document, have it have a trigger fire off, and call something that will score it using a neural net, so you can go off and find it later. So the question is, how do you do that? And frankly, the database engine itself is not in the neural net business. It is not in the computation of vectors from document business, because that's all application specific. So the more interesting thing to do is to
So we'll pick this up out of the break, folks. Hold that thought. We're talking to several experts on AI and database. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio.
Okay.
What if you could?
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, talking to several experts. What a show today. Andrew Turner from Praxi, formerly known as PraxiData. That's Praxi. We've got Neal Hansch from Silicon Foundry, now part of Kearney, apparently. Learned that today. And Jim Starkey of AmorphousDB. And Jim, you're right in the middle of a thought talking about the AI-ready database. So go ahead and finish your thought on that.
Yeah, sure. I was saying the first couple steps is doing intelligent handling of documents to be able to understand it and index them. But when you get into the AI domain, there's some more steps that you need to take. And so we're taking those steps, and we're going to see where it's going to go. But what you really need is, since all of the AI work now, is almost all of it is being done in Python, is to be able to call out of a database into Python user-defined procedures. And if only that were simple. But that's the step. So what you really want to be able to do is a couple things. One is, when you enter a document into the system, it fires off a trigger that calls a Python procedure that computes the vectors for the paragraphs in the document, and they get stored in the database. And later, when somebody does a query, an English language query, it runs that through a user-defined procedure that runs the stuff through a neural net that produces the vectors that describes what the query is, and then the database systems can just go ahead and use an index vector for similarity search to find out what's the nearest paragraphs from that going to the document. So I think that's the next step, is to automate this stuff in a database context.
Wow. That's very interesting. So to explain to our audience the way these vector databases work, and they are key for implementation of private or corporate large language model deployments. And what you do is you use the vector database to store your embeddings, is what they're called. And embeddings are whatever your corporate data is. Maybe it's the policies and procedures of the organization. Maybe it's sales. It could be any number of things. You can store anything as a vector. And a vector is really just it's a point and a trajectory, right? And then the similarity search happens when you're doing your prompt. The LLM will look and say, okay, well, what's similar to this that would look similar to what they're asking about? And that's how it actually cranks out the result that you get. So, I mean, we've basically converted to geometric values, essentially, all this text and all these letters and sentences and content, and then it kind of reflects back. So what you're talking about is really being able to thread multiple stages of a process in one engine to do, again, what I was saying before, would normally require multiple systems to get to an answer. Is that about right, Jim?
That's about right. The idea is to make everything automatic. You enter the data and it does what it needs to do regardless. And when you want to do a query, it figures out the best way to do it.
Yeah. I mean, in the database world, the query
very
optimizer
simple.
is a pretty important thing, right? I mean, it takes a while to optimize the optimizer. It's not optimized out of the gate, right? So that's the other thing you've tackled. Well, let's bring in our good buddy Andrew Turner, who's been patiently waiting in the wings over there. Andrew Turner from Praxi. I've done some work with these guys, and I keep laughing about the line I came up: divide and classify, right? Which is what you guys are doing.
I think it was a great line. It was a great line. Don't knock it. It was a good one.
To the 80%. So, I mean, you think about, we talked about this for years, right? When people say structured data in our industry, typically what they mean is data in a relational database. That's basically what they're saying, because every data has some structure, and these LLMs have done a great job of kind of cracking the code of what that looks like in prose format, for example. In other formats, it writes haiku, to write a sonnet for you if you want. It does really good stuff at that. But you are attacking this absolutely massive space of unstructured data. So PDFs, Word documents, emails, all kinds of communication that, let's face it, hold the essence of the organization in them. And if companies want to leverage these LLMs and really make them sing, they're going to have to use some sort of RAG model that references their corporate data. But you got to be careful what data you put in there. I always joke training one of these models is like raising a kid. You want to be careful what you say around your kid, because he or she will say it back at an inappropriate time. And that is going to happen with these models, right? But tell us a bit about Praxi and what you're doing.
Yeah. So great to be here. Great to be with Jim and Neal and yourself. And Praxi is actually going to be 6 years old in May this year. So we're not a teenager yet, but we're getting there. It was founded by my colleague Andrew, who's also another Andrew, who originally started the New York Stock Exchange, and we worked together in a previous business where we were selling into enterprises. And the genesis of Praxi was that we found that people wanted to put their arms around their data, but actually what the problem was, from time to value, it was taking too long. So what we basically built at Praxi is a very, very cloud native, fast solution to doing data curation, data classification. So, where is, in that 80% of the data that's not being, you don't have your arms around it, that untapped data, that dark data, which, I mean, I was astounded at this statistic a bit earlier the other day, 175 zettabytes of data by next year. And 80% of that is untapped. So, there's some risks, there's some opportunity in there. So what we're focused on is certain industries and use cases. And we basically built some pre-trained models and fine-tune those models for specific use cases in insurance, in banking, in fintech, and healthcare, and also working with the defense industries as well, federal, to really pick off certain things. Because if you look at an enterprise today, there's all this hype around what's been happening since that, I think it was 7th of November 2022, when OpenAI burst onto the scene. How do you actually grab your arms around this? You can't do it in one flick of switch. So what we're doing is specifically targeted use cases where we're very narrow, but very deep, and doing this at scale, at cloud scale. The amount of money that I think Microsoft spent in 2022 was like $19 billion in their R&D team. So it's like, how do you train these models? How do you actually have the GPU, the hardware capacity to actually pre-train them? So we're seeing a big opportunity to deliver these pre-trained models to give people a leg up, and actually then pick off certain use cases, because you can't do the whole enterprise in one go.
Yeah. Well, and let's talk a bit about ontologies. So to explain to the audience here, you can just imagine, even at a mid-sized organization, you've got tons and tons of data. I mean, a lot of times you'll access it through SharePoint, for example, but there are all these proposals and letters and contracts and all kinds of other things. And if you're going to let AI loose on your data, you better be sure you know which data you're letting it loose on, because otherwise you'll train it with bad data, which is a very, very, very bad idea. So you're using these ontologies to really start the process and sort of pre-classify X amount of data, and then the users will sort of curate that and say yes and no and sort of manually go through. But the idea is you are focused on preparing corporate data for use with AI and other future technologies, right?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there is the thing about this classic thing about public versus private. So we're advocating that we put an ebook out last summer, collaborating with Dr. Robin Blur and yourself, around some of the perils around that and the mysteries, so I demystify it. But what we see is that metadata is incredibly important. So if you go back to the stuff that Jim did in the database world, the data about the data, that's the key thing here. Because obviously for whether you're using a vector database, a knowledge graph, whatever type of enabling technology, that is that consistency. So what we basically built is a way of profiling that data and matching that data, and then that gives you that intelligence to search, to then work out what data is usable, what data is what data is the right data to use for your decision making, and get really improve the productivity of data workers, because obviously people are getting more data literate, but actually how do you improve that and step change that? So they're wallowing in data. The stat from one of our advisory board was confirmed in the week is that still they reckon that 80% of time of people in this data function is just trying to find the data. So how do we give them a leg up? And then if you add on that thing about the untapped data that's not being actually, you haven't got your arms around that dark data, you've got a bigger problem, building if you don't start to address that. It's not sexy. There's a lot of generic, tools. Everybody's put AI on the back of their tool. Everybody's an AI tool now. But what we were looking to do is just be the expert and the leader in that curation classification space, because that really is the jump off point. It's the foundation of all these other initiatives that you want to do around AI. If you get your data foundation right, you're in a good place.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And as I'm thinking again about how this applies to the business world and what these LLMs can do, and what they're very, very good at is, for example, policy. Policy can be very complex if you have a policy document, let's say rules and regulations for running a hospital, for example. In the UK and the United States, other countries, they have, I mean, reams of documentation about regulations, which are incredibly difficult for a human being to ponder or even learn, because there's so much of it. But it's not a problem for these large language models to digest and then basically summarize for you. So you can find out things like, how would I go about, what someone was joking the other day, how do I go about firing someone? I don't know the policy. If you've entered all your information about your regulations into the system, into your private model, you can ask it, how do I fire someone? It'll say, step 1, give them a letter of discontent that says they are not performing properly. Step 2, after 2 weeks, do this. Step 3, they can pull from that stuff and just dynamically spin up a very cogent set of instructions for how to do something. That's a huge deal. I mean, that is just that's a step change in terms of how to do it. Because you think there are very few people, and they're consultants who make lots and lots of money, who know that stuff, and you can call on and pay $350 an hour to tell you, or you can load the documents into your ChatGPT instance and just ask questions. What do you think about that,
Yes,
Andrew?
but Eric,
Go
let
ahead.
me just point out, what has happened to any number of lawyers who submitted ChatGPT briefs,
Yeah,
and
I know,
when the
I've
other
heard.
side started looking at them, says, "Wait, it made these up from scratch." So
Well, and this is, yeah,
I
but this
worry a
is,
lot about non-human summarizing human knowledge for other humans.
Yeah. No, it's a good point, but I think that's almost been overplayed a bit as the cautionary tale. And I think there is some fear, quite frankly, in various industries about how disruptive this is going to be. But if you're careful about feeding it the documents and then just asking it from that document, it's going to do a pretty good job of nailing that down. But you're right.
But having
Go
that
ahead.
conversation with your data and actually getting some consistency of execution of those business rules, yeah, and
Right.
those policies, that's the
Right.
key. So, you know, a number of insurance companies that we're working in that are global, got multiple operating companies, operating geographies. You know, how do you actually enforce them? There's lots of stuff in filing cabinets. They need to actually index, curate that, get that in an accessible place. But also you've got the privacy piece. You know, there's a lot of jurisdictions now actually becoming more national in their sovereignty of that data. So, you know, you've got that complexity as well. So it's not actually becoming, I wouldn't say the technical stuff is like flick a switch, but actually the legal ramifications and the piece around how you actually get the business to understand putting this stuff in place is going to be the key thing. So the change management around that, the stuff that Neal and his team and are going to be putting in place as well around this technology stack is going to be as important, because the technology stuff has moved. It's not constrained anymore.
Right.
Assuming you make the right decisions around which one you select. But
Right.
but you know, I think that's the thing that we're seeing is the piece around driving consistency, productivity, which is going to, you know, either improve service, reduce cost, and obviously automate and enable revenue, which is what you want to do.
Yeah. No, that's right. And you make a good point, Jim. There's no doubt about it. You got to be careful about using this stuff. We had Mark Palmer on the show the other day, and he said he read some report, I can't remember where it's from, that said that most people who are using these engines are just taking the content and just plopping it out into the real world. He's like, no, don't do that. They do hallucinate, so you have to validate things, but at least it kind of gets you along the way and lets you get most of the way through a process to learn more about it. But again, it has to be widely published, right? So the more esoteric something is, the more fringe, for example, the less likely you are going to get very high quality answers out of it. But the point is, the cat is out of the bag, or as I joked in one of our shows, the chat is out of the bag. It's out there, and people are using it, and you're not going to stop them. You know, and it's bigger than the iPhone. Remember the iPad when the iPad came out, and it created BYOD. The whole bring your own device trend started because the iPad was so cool that IT teams simply couldn't stand in the way. Because guess what? Their CEO comes rolling in with his iPad. He's like, I don't care if you don't support it. I'm using it and I like it. So why don't you change your freaking rules? And they did. They did change the rules. So I think that, you know, we're going to see, and we'll bring Neal Hansch back in the next segment here in just a minute here. But here's what I see happening on the sort of macro scale is you look at what Uber did. And I remember when Uber was just running roughshod over city councils all over the country and all around the world, quite frankly. And I realized I'm like, oh, I know what their plan is. They basically said, we don't care. We're going to put a bunch of money aside for lawsuits and, you know, probably should I use the B word? Let's just say tempting lawmakers with investments to their campaigns, for example. And they're just going to run roughshod over the world and put this thing out there. And they sure did.
Well, you don't. Well,
And
you
all,
don't. I mean, I'm obviously in London, so it's like you should probably see by the backdrop. But you know, if you were talking to a black cab driver in London during that process, I mean, it was absolutely war. I mean, it
oh,
was
yeah.
just literally, it was,
Yeah.
you know, the gloves were off.
Yeah, and they're going to stay off for a while, and I think that's coming to this space. But folks, don't touch that dial. We're having a fascinating conversation here with Andrew Turner, Jim Starkey, and Neal Hansch. We'll be right back. You are listening to DM Radio.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks, welcome back to DM Radio. I should explain the title, by the way. I meant to do that at the top of the hour, How to Ride the Seventh Wave. Sting has a song called Seventh Wave, Love is the Seventh Wave, but there's a movie, Papillon, I watched years ago with Steve McQueen and Dustin Hoffman, and they were trapped on this island, like a prisoner island, and way up high over a bay, they would strategize about how they could get a raft and throw it off the cliff and then dive in after it. And if they timed it right, the seventh wave would carry them back out. So the theory is the seventh wave is the big one. It's, of course, popular in surfing terms, but I feel this AI stuff today is the seventh wave, people. Trust me, this is the seventh wave. How are you going to ride this wave to success for your organization? That's the topic for today. And Neal Hansch, who's been very patiently on the phone, I think he just drove up to his house. Neal, you've heard us ranting and raving about this stuff. What are your thoughts on what's happening out there and how companies can turn all this to their advantage?
Yes. So I think, especially the conversation last half hour, so much of it was, where's the data? Do we have good data? What are the rules around the data? Which is, so similar for the last 20 years around business intelligence and data analytics. So it's only, further increases for these large enterprises as they have been trying to figure out, how to leverage data for, to make decisions. And so I realized that was a very generic comment. I think, one thing I would say as well, we talked a lot about, especially at the beginning of the hour here, around the speed and the pace of change. For Foundry in our business, we kind of live in the world of startups and venture capital, and there was an incredible rise in all tech investing in emerging companies during the pandemic. It definitely cooled off in 2022 as, everything digital and not necessarily came back to earth, but boy, AI, has had such an incredible and tremendous amount of investment, of course, both at the startup level, but also with, I know Microsoft was referenced earlier, and Google and Meta. And so I think that's one thing that we are really keeping an eye on, which is what will happen in 2024. So a lot of this is where are we at today and what does 2024 look like? And I think, most of the venture capitalists would say AI investment is continuing unabated. There will certainly be consolidation. When you look at the majors, I think NVIDIA just had another blowout quarter they announced earlier this week. What was it? One of the few first $1 trillion market cap companies, and obviously a key infrastructure provider in all of this. But I think 2024, from what we're seeing, as much as anything, kind of goes back to what are the applications? What are the most common applications? And then also, how do we get the cost down? One thing that we haven't touched upon yet, I think, was the training of the models.
Right.
And are using off-the-shelf models, or for the large enterprises, how do they go about training, and what are the costs for which parts of training? Which, once again, goes back to how are they going to use it in their enterprise, and what are they going to look to Microsoft or the other usual suspect, incumbent technology providers that they lean on heavily, versus what might they look to, best-in-class, specific use case, or best of breed, as the saying goes, in the OpenAIs of the world, the Anthropics and others.
Yeah. And, speaking of cost, I'm glad you threw that out there because I wanted to mention a tweet that I saw just yesterday, I guess. So my good buddy Diane Hinchcliffe, who is incredibly knowledgeable, he was sharing information about NVIDIA and their huge results, blowout quarter, achieved all-time high quarterly revenue of 22.1 billion, 22% increase from Q3, 265% growth, et cetera. And some smarty pants responded to that, writing, as it turns out, convincing firms to throw hardware at the problem of inefficient deep neural networks is good for business. The clock is ticking, though. I read that. I just had to laugh. Neal, do you want to comment on that? And then maybe Jim Starkey comment on it. Go ahead. Neal, do you want to comment on that?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, I'm still enjoying that comment myself, right? Yeah, I mean, it reminds me, as an aside, quantum computing. Not to introduce something totally different, but
right.
A number of our clients are trying to figure out quantum, right? What are the use cases today, and beyond cybersecurity and some of the others that tend to get most of the headlines, right? But regardless of where that conversation heads, it pretty quickly goes to cost. Right. Yeah. So expensive today that only, pharma drug discovery, because if it can improve that process, the returns are so significant. But I think as we go back here, we had a private dinner with Mosaic not long ago before they got acquired by Databricks, but so much of that conversation was around how to get the cost down. Yeah, it's hardware being a part of it, of course. And so, beyond all of the capabilities of what we've been referencing in the past hour, then dovetailing it back to the cost here and now, and how will the cost curve go down, as it always does, as we know in technology. But how quickly will that happen? Because that may, very well, and it certainly will in 2024, kind of dictate where the adoption, happens fastest and broadest.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I'll throw it over to Jim Starkey. I'm sure you find that amusing. I mean,
Oh my God, you may have found an area where I do not have a solid opinion.
oh no,
Yeah,
wow.
yes, I have to tell you, my personal motto is often wrong, but never in doubt. But the
That's funny.
what I see the role of database in all of this, and it's a little bit more conservative view than other people have espoused, is take the data, whatever form it is, cram it into the database, put on as many servers as you need to for whatever your purposes are, and then be able to intelligently get the stuff back accurately and correctly. And having somebody else produce a system that with a large language model to produce an essay of what may or may not be correct, that's very good. That's somebody else's problem. My job is to use the best intelligent way to give them back what they asked for that is stored in the database system, and they can make their own decisions on the credibility of what comes back. So
Yeah, and I guess the reason I threw that one over to you was just thinking about how you were talking about the automation processes under the covers in Amorphous and what you're doing there, because that amounts to a sort of second generation optimizer, if you will. And I think the comment about inefficient neural networks is what struck my thought process there, because, if it's just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And there are lots of ways to optimize things. So yeah, you can throw hardware at it, or you can come up with a better design, a better model, a better approach to tackling the situation. But maybe Andrew Turner, I'll throw it over to you
Yeah,
to comment
I
on as
think,
well.
yeah, I mean, if you look at the costs, I mean, some of the stuff we're working with NVIDIA as part of their Inception program, and one of the things that we're seeing is that you've got this thing about you've got LLMs, which is the kind of default, and then you've got what we call SLMs, small language models. So actually, the piece around this is why we basically want to help customers to get along that journey quicker by giving them the pre-trained models, and then they can fine tune it. So that process of fine tuning and retraining it with your own data, because that's where you actually get to the outcome a lot quicker. Because otherwise, if you give them just a raw infrastructure, it's going to take them too long to get to value. So we see as being our pre-trained industry libraries for use cases, that's going to really give them a leg up. Because obviously the cloud scalers won't say no to obviously processing the data on the cloud. But what we're also seeing is people doing things on premise as well, and actually putting some other infrastructure in place to do that. And not putting everything in the cloud, because obviously if you look at the costs of that, it can be prohibitive. So what's the balance between that public and private LLMs, SLMs, and then also what you do on premise versus what you do in the cloud? So I think those are the kind of some of the factors that we're seeing around getting a better cost model that's more digestible for the board.
Yeah, I think I've joked before that the rumors of on-prem's demise have been greatly exaggerated, and I think we're starting to see some people come back from the cloud. And David Linthicum just wrote yesterday on LinkedIn, or at least I saw it just yesterday, talking about organizations wanting to move off mainframe for some of their critical business processes. And he's like, well, why? Do you really need to do that? I mean, if it's running and it's doing what it's supposed to do, just leave it alone. In the IT world, by and large, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Like, just let it go. And my good buddy Rick Sherman, who I learned recently, just I guess a couple days ago, had passed away last year, which was very sad. He's the nicest guy, very, very smart consultant out of Boston. But he would joke that he was not a fan of the modern data stack. I'll say that. He goes, it sounds good, but when you start looking at it, it's all stitched together with a couple lines of very frail code, and the whole thing can just come collapsing down. So you get these trends in our industry, and you have to be careful. Who did I see just writing about this? I think it was Merv Adrian was writing. What CIO or CTO ever buys a trend? You don't buy things for trends. You buy technology to solve problems. Now, the trend is an indication of a solution set or a challenge space or something that's evolving that you have to watch out for. But you got to be very careful about following the trends, because that'll just kind of lead you down the garden path, and that's not a place you really want to go. But podcast bonus segment is coming up next. Look these folks up online: Andrew Turner from Praxi, Jim Starkey from AmorphousDB, and Neal Hansch from Silicon Foundry. You have been listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, time for the podcast bonus segment here on a fascinating DM Radio. We've been talking to Andrew Turner of Praxi, Neal Hansch of Silicon Foundry, and Jim Starkey himself, Snarky Starkey as I call him. He makes the occasional snarky comment. And I will tell you, one of our regular audience members, a guy who works for ExxonMobil, he was all excited to learn about this, but he said, all right, I want to know multimodal, multi-model. That's what MarkLogic does. They got bought by Progress. I didn't hear that. That kind of surprised me. But he asked, what have you got that MarkLogic doesn't have? And what have you got that Snowflake doesn't got? Go ahead.
Put me on the spot.
Yeah, exactly.
Let me tell you exactly where we are in terms of business development. The way I develop technology, and I have always done it this way, is that I sit down with the problems that I think need to be solved and work by myself developing the technology. And I don't like selling stuff that I don't know is complete. So I wait until I know I've got all of the major problems solved and the minor problems have solutions. So I'm reaching that point now with Amorphous. So we're not yet on the market. And we are still going around. I would have to say we would probably be on the market right now if the AI stuff hadn't hit.
Right.
But, going out there without an AI component is crazy at this point. So, we're at an early stage. We're in the process of looking for investment. Then we're going to start looking for customers. So comparing us to a mature system that's been out there for a long time is difficult.
Yeah.
Even if I knew what they did.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty funny. Maybe Neal Hansch, I'll throw it over to you. As you talk again to your clients in the C-suite, I mean, they know that danger looms in every direction these days. I mean, it's really, I've never seen a market so precarious. Of course, there are world events happening all around that are very dangerous and troubling. What's the general thrust of advice that you give them on how to tackle this change in the rate of innovation, which really is remarkable? And one thing I'll throw out there is don't sign long-term contracts. Sign short-term contracts.
Yeah.
There's no telling what's going to happen. What do you think, Neal?
Right. We might agree with you, except when it comes to signing long-term contracts with us, then we highly recommend that.
Of course.
But I think, and it's really no different for us per se. In the accelerating rate of innovation and disruption is a positive, if you will. I think we would look at it as figuring out, which of these to leverage, right? And so it's less about disruption. It's more the positivity around here's all this innovation. If you can time it right and figure out which parts of it to move forward with. And I can tell you we had a somewhat relevant story, but at one point we had a bunch of trained CEOs, right? So they've got billions of dollars of tracks and hardware and CapEx, right? And it's, hey, it would come to Silicon Valley for a visit and kind of sit back with their arms crossed, right? We're not going to be disrupted. Now we could say, here's a couple of ways that you will be, but it was more about, let's talk about innovation that you should be leveraging. Let's talk about inspecting the train tracks. You shouldn't have to roll a truck out there. You could have drones with computer vision, and
Right.
it's faster and cheaper and higher degree of safety. So let's look at the positive elements. So increasing speed of innovation. Yes, it could mean disruption for your business, but more often than not, this is just the areas, but you need to you need to figure out, and your team, you need to have that expertise. You're not going to create all of these new technologies, but to figure out which ones to take advantage of. And today or tomorrow or 18 months from now, and that's the right lens and as an executive and the way you should be thinking about it.
That's great. I love that. And I love the forward thinking aspect of it. And I think you really hit the nail on the head. There are always opportunities to use these technologies, and drones are absolutely amazing. I mean, drones revolutionized the insurance industry. I learned from a guy that they thought it used to cost like $4,000 or $5,000 per house to inspect when a hurricane comes through. Now with drones, it's like $400 per house.
Right.
I mean, that is a huge, you're talking about chopping off massive chunks of budget, of expense, and greatly increasing the quality as well. So if you could do something like that, and I got to tell you, speaking of trained CEOs, we're about 40 miles from East Palestine, where I am right now. So we know all about train derailments and the unpleasantness that they can cause. There's a reason why you call it a train wreck when it's really bad, because a train wreck is really, really bad. But with that last little tidbit, I'll throw it over to Andrew Turner, who can help companies avoid a train wreck with their data. Final thoughts from you on your advice for what companies should do to tackle their unstructured data. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, structured, semi-structured, or unstructured data, we do the whole thing. But I mean, one of the things I was just going to say was, do you want to be a cheetah or an elephant? Yeah. So it's that about, you know, how fast you want to go.
Right.
And you know, I think there's you can get stuff done in an unconstrained way. We could deploy in, you know, days and weeks rather than months and years, which is, you know, what you used to have to you take your months to set up the program, and then you start delivering some value. So I think all those things that we're seeing is, you know, how do you be very agile? We're just about to launch our SaaS version on AWS Marketplace literally in the next few weeks, where we'll have a free tier. You know, we can try before you buy, you can get the value, prove it, and then scale it. So, you know, we're looking at ways of changing the way we do the distribution model of what we've got from a value point. We've got some patents that we want to share as well. So, you know, it's all to go after, I think. And I really hope that people grab hold of this data agenda and get their arms around it, because it's, you know, as Neal said a bit earlier, it's been a recurring theme for a long time.
Right.
Maybe we can make 2024 in the future, you know, where you actually get this thing nailed properly, and you know, we believe we've got a really good proposition to help them do that.
I love it. Well, look these folks up online. Andrew Turner from Praxi, Jim Starkey of AmorphousDB, and Neal Hansch of Silicon Foundry. Folks, you have been listening to a fantastic DM Radio.